I'm Scott Hansen, host of NFL Red Zone. Lowe's knows Sundays are for football. That's why we're here to help you get your next DIY project done, even when the clock isn't on your side. Whether that's a new Filtrete filter or Bosch and Cobalt power tools, Lowe's has everything you need to feel like the MVP of DIY. So get it done and earn your Sunday. Shop now, in-store and online. Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
It's the Smucker's Uncrustables podcast with your host, Uncrustables. Okay, today's guest is rough around the edges. Please welcome Crust.
Thanks for having me.
Today's topic, he's round with soft, pillowy bread.
Hey.
Filled with delicious PB&J.
Are you talking about yourself?
And you can take him anywhere.
Why'd you invite?
And we are out of time.
Are you really cutting me off?
Uncrustables are the best part of the sandwich. Sorry, Crust.
Tonight, turn down the noise of the day and focus on the rest with AGZ, the nightly drink for winding down and resting up. New from AG1. AGZ supports your body's natural sleep cycle with clinically studied key herbs, adaptogens, and minerals in amounts supported by research. And no melatonin, helping you wake feeling rested. Wind down, rest up with AGZ. Learn more at drinkagz.com.
Hello and welcome to the Paddock and The Pavilion, probably the only podcast that brings you both horse racing and cricket. With me, your host, Stephen Wallis. Today our focus is firmly on horse racing and the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe. I'm delighted to welcome back to the show Oli Hein, the author and former diplomat, who will be sharing his thoughts on some of the greatest winners of this world-famous race. In the first of 2 episodes, Oli reflects on the Arc-winning champions from Great Britain, Ireland and Italy, who feature in his book, Punch a Hole in the Wind. Hello, Oli. Thanks for joining me again on the show.
Stephen, it's great to be back again. Many thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm looking forward to this episode, Oli. We last caught up in episode 334, Grand National Immortals, when we spoke about the greatest Grand National winners of all time.
That's right. I can't remember, it's that many months ago since we last spoke, but yeah, and it's it would be great this time to sort of talk about the great flat horses, but not just the ones from Britain, but I think from a few from all around Europe, in fact, because more specifically, I'm hoping we're going to talk about the Arc, because it is the season of the Arc.
Yeah, I hope we're going to talk about the Arc. That's all my notes.
Yes.
And it's about your book, Punch a Hole in the Wind. And in your opinion, the greatest winners of that famous race, the Arc de Triomphe, run in October. Has it always been the first Sunday in October?
Yes, I think it has been. It's I mean, as a sort of long background behind that, I can sort of explain some of the rationale behind the book and then the rationale behind the sort of setup of the Arc as well, if you like. So as far as the book contains not just the great Arc winners, but some of the 50 greatest flat horses from all around the world since the dawn of film, basically, because racing has that who was the greatest debate that every other sport has, which is a pretty unwinnable one. But what I had noticed before I wrote this was just how the books that I had that sort of captured great racehorses were, there was always a pattern. The ones that were written by the UK authors were just massively biased towards UK and Irish horses. And then I read a US book of the greatest horses, and you would be forgiven after you read that for thinking that horse racing was a uniquely American sport because there was nobody else from outside America. And I just thought, we live in a very global world with flat racing. So I wanted to write something that sort of really made this more of a global appreciation of some of the greats from all around the world. And alongside that, being adamant that I wasn't going to rank them. Anyone who says, oh, Man o' War was better than See the Stars or Winx was better than Tudor Minstrel, I mean, they're just walking into a self-made trap. It's impossible to quantify. So I see this book as a celebration, not a competition, just like Immortals, which we discussed earlier this year. So that's the rationale, but that's the USP, if you will, behind the book.
And because flat racing itself is more international, you've got more international horses in this book.
Yeah, I've got, there's lots from America, there's lots from Australia, there's lots from France, Britain, Ireland. You can count Dubai, I guess, if you count Dubai Millennium as well. So trying to get all, and Japan. And we're going to talk about one of those later on too, and Hong Kong. So yeah, it's about trying to really distill some of those greats, but not saying these are the greatest, end of story, because that's an unwinnable debate. But it's a celebration. That's how I look at it.
And it's all a matter of opinion. I was going to ask you horses that were close to being included, because this book was published in 2022, I think, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. There were a few that sort of I thought, shan't I include them? But they're the ones who I'm going to probably include if ever I go and do another one. At least there's a certain list of horses who I was keen to include for that will won the Arc, for example. Sindar, Pente Célèbre, Lamtara, and then going back, horses like Ballymos, Exbury, one you may not have heard of, Caracalla, who I think is very interesting as well, and then more recently Zarkava, who won in the last 20 years or so too, and unbeaten. So lots of horses who didn't quite make it, but spaces of the premium. But I wanted to sort of enjoy 50 rather than not be able to indulge 100, let's say.
Well, in this podcast, we're going to talk about the true stars of the Arc, including the near misses. There's 3 of them, plus your own trips to Longchamp. And at the end, I'm going to ask you for who you think is the best.
And break my own rule. But yes, I will give that a go with lots of caveats, Stephen. Happy to do that.
Now, the race was first run in 1920, and there was a British winner the first time.
There was, but we need to sort of go. But the actual race coming into, I mean, if I can do a little potted history of this race,
certainly, yeah.
That the Jockey Club in England had started in 1780, but the French equivalent, which was the Société d'encouragement pour l'amélioration des races de chevaux en France, which is quite a mouthful, that didn't arrive till 1833. We know that now as France Galop. That's what it's become. But the whole mission was to basically improve French-bred racehorses. And so throughout, because they knew they were a long way behind England at the time, so throughout the 19th century, there was a big effort to try and bring over lots of stallions. The big change, I think, happened in 1865 with the French horses when Gladiateur basically came over, won the English Triple Crown, then won
the Avenger of Waterloo.
The Avenger of Waterloo, that's right. And you can still see his statue at Longchamp, in fact. So, and he won the Ascot Gold Cup also by 40 lengths. And basically, that was basically the French saying, we've arrived. And the English took a step back and said, okay, maybe we shouldn't be quite so exceptionalist after all. So Longchamp itself had just been set up in 1857, basically, was when it first sort of properly opened, I think. Until then, Paris had actually done races on the Champ de Mars, which is where the Eiffel Tower is. So there was the big race in France at the time for the big race for 3-year-olds that opened to all countries was the Grand Prix de Paris, which started in 1863. But and that had a big reputation, and it carried on even after the Arc had started as being their big race, I think, their biggest one. Then there was the introduction of another race, the Prix du Conseil Municipal, which was more of an international race with different age horses, not just 3-year-olds, and also over 1.5 miles, because the Grand Prix de Paris had been over 15 furlongs, quite a bit longer. But it was only after, I think, the resumption of the First World War that the French racing authority said, we need to be even more ambitious and then inaugurate like a strictly weight for age championship race over 12 furlongs rather than 15 and make it at the end of the year, not the middle. Or that, yes, as I said, the Grand Prix Paris would continue being as big as, or if not better, for the first 15 odd years of the Arc's existence. And they needed a good name for this race. And the Arc de Triomphe, of course, in Paris is a great celebration of France's victories, especially with World War I so fresh. And so it seemed very fitting, a good, prestigious, resonant name. There was one other option they had for it, which was the Prix de la Victoire, speaks for itself. And rather than go for that, there was actually already a race called the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe before 1920, the first race, which was actually a minor selling race. And they thought, no, let's just burgle the name and associate it instead with this new championship race. And the rest is history.
Because at that time in 1920, there weren't many races for the classic winners as they got older, and even at 3, because the Eclipse I was looking didn't start until 1886.
That's right. Pattern racing and sort of group 1, grade 1 racing outside of the the sort of classics of the classics themselves, and the Ascot Gold Cups, the sort of old traditional races, they didn't exist in the same way that they do now, across the world, in fact, not just in Europe. So it was very much part of that movement during the 20th century to really have proper championship races that 3-year-olds, for instance, could then go and compete against the 4-year-olds, but in a non-handicap environment. So yeah, that was one of the big things that not just France, but also England, Ireland, and lots of other countries sort of started doing at the time.
To give more perspective, the King George didn't start until 1951 at Ascot.
51, that's right. It was called the Festival of Britain Stakes just before, but it sort of evolved into, and it's really quite late, isn't it? Because we sort of see it as this absolute stalwart of midsummer. But yeah, those great non-classic races, many of them only started in the early or mid 20th century.
Let's then move on to the near misses and give you a chance to show us all your knowledge about the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe. I've got 3 horses here: Faris, Deep Impact, and Nijinsky. Now, Faris in 1939 didn't even run in the Arc
because there wasn't an Arc. That's right. So I think I'm glad you started with Faris, actually, because yeah, the Arc. This was the Arc that never was, 1939, and you're probably thinking, well, okay, he wasn't a near miss because he didn't sort of run, but actually he was, I think, one of the greatest horses that most people haven't heard of. And just to sort of, if you haven't heard of him, let me just say a bit more. He came out of the huge sort of conveyor belt that Marcel Boussac, the sort of great owner breeder of the mid 20th century, who changed and reshaped how breeding and studs could be done, and he was an incredible success throughout that period. And in fact, let me just give you a quick Marcel Boussac fact. After he won the Epsom Derby in 1950 with his horse called Galcador, he was overheard to say in the winner's enclosure, "I've got 6 better than him back in France." And he wasn't joking. I mean, that's how much he had in terms of good quality. But he swore to the end of his days that Faris was the best horse he'd ever seen, let alone bred. And, you did well to listen to him. So Faris was an absolutely black horse. Black is not a horse, and a thing we say about horses very often, but he was black. Never ran as a 2-year-old. He was too scopy. So he only ran 3 times in his entire life. He started off in the Prix Noailles, 12 furlongs, under Charlie Elliott, who was his British jockey, but based in France. Cruised to victory. He then won, in apparently stunning style, the Prix du Jockey Club, the French Derby, 3 weeks later in June 39, which many people said was who'd seen lots, said it was the best we'd ever seen because he just came from the back in amazing circumstances. And it was only a fortnight after that the biggest race in Europe at the time, which was the Grand Prix Paris, he was entered into that. So 60,000 people attended Longchamp that day. They don't get those numbers anymore, unfortunately, in the place. But you had the French president there, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor there. And Faris won that despite having stumbled towards the back. And this was a 15-furlong race. And I am not just Marcel Boussac. I think that he's one of the most amazing things I have ever seen, because if you sneak onto you do a clever search on YouTube, you will find Faris's, or just 10 seconds without any commentary really, of the end of Faris's race, and you have never seen a horse accelerate past others as quick as this. It's quite astonishing. And it was such an impressive performance that you even had sort of poems being written in the Figaro the next day about how incredible it was. You had people saying that this was, the new goalposts in horse racing. It was astonishing. And even, the jockey who came in the second place, Charles Bouillon, we'll talk about later. He said, "When I heard a horse coming up behind me, I immediately looked round, but he had already gone past." And when you watch the video, you can actually see that happening. It's quite amazing. And I think one of the most impressive things I've ever seen on video. So he then went over to England to go and try and run the St. Leger against the big English hope at the time, Blue Peter, who'd won the first 2 legs of the Triple Crown. Then, of course, that was going to be called the Duel of Town Moor. Everybody was very excited. Then, sadly, we know what happened in September 39. War declared, St. Leger cancelled. Of course, the Arc was cancelled, and Faris would have been the big favourite for the Arc. And I think if he'd won that, of course, we don't know, but if he'd won it, it would have been, he would have cemented himself as one of the greats, possibly carried on the following year. and more people would have actually heard about, one of the greatest European horses to have run in the 20th century, whereas very few people actually know about Faris now. And incidentally, extra little fact, he was commandeered by the Germans out of his stud in the 1940s and taken to Germany and going used as a breeding horse there. Fortunately, he came back alive, which not all of the great horses who'd been in stud in Normandy had been returned. So, yeah, he was. That was a near miss for a race that never was, if you will, Stephen.
Just going back, although we're getting off a bit subject here, but in the St. Leger, he did actually arrive in England, didn't he?
He did. He came over to England. He settled in the yard of Steve Donoghue, who I'm sure some listeners know was one of the former great champion jockey in the sort of first third of the century. And he was trying it out as a trainer at the time. So it was, everything was there in place for him to carry on. And it was just the fate that got in his way. Just bad timing.
So, yeah, he was just born at the wrong time then, really.
Totally, yeah. But worth looking up for those who haven't seen.
We're going to move forward now to 1970. Nijinsky, the last Triple Crown winner. And he lost his unbeaten record in the Arc. He
did. Nijinsky was fascinating in many ways. So let's just take a step back. I mean, again, your readers will know lots about him. But here's a few little things before we talk about his Arc thing. So firstly, Nijinsky was quick. So in the Epsom Derby, which he won, his penultimate furlong in that race, when he overtakes Gier, he was timed at 10.6 seconds. There's only one furlong has ever been run quicker than that in the entire history of the Derby, as far as we know. Again, it was the penultimate furlong, and that was Dancing Brave. So he was quick. His performance in the King George, one of the most amazing, immobile Piggott on him that day. Only Mongeuse was as impressive, I think. And then, but another thing, Lester Piggott was in awe of him. But he did say that Nijinsky was actually quite mysterious. So he was quoted as saying, "He wouldn't talk to me. He never talked to me. Nijinsky had that far-off look in his eye from the first time I saw him. It was like he was looking right through you." So he's actually quite an enigmatic character. But the one thing we know is that when he came to the Arc, he'd just run a very difficult St. Leger when he had suffered from ringworm, which I think some people said, well, yeah, that's why he lost the Arc, because he'd had ringworm beforehand. But it may not be as simple as that. When he sort of arrived, it was a strong but beatable field. And it was only when he came to make his move in the final straight, he was matched by Yves Saint-Martin on Sassafras, who was the Prix du Jockey Club winner. And it was actually quite hard. These were the days before you had those big screens, the lovely big screens sort of showing you in detail what was happening. So if you were in the audience that day in the crowd, sometimes if you were just behind the post, you didn't know who'd won. And interestingly, my dad was there that day. And he said nobody knew who'd won, and they were all sort of wondering. There wasn't any big announcements, and he was waiting in the winners' enclosure afterwards. And first he saw Lester Piggott come back on Nijinsky, looking even more hangdog than he normally did, and then he saw Yves Saint-Martin come back with a huge grin on his face. He went, Nijinsky got beaten. But until then, I don't think most people actually knew. So I think it was a very close race. And exciting. And there was one theory, though, because I mentioned earlier on he was quick. Arguably, it could be that he didn't really stay a mile and a half. So one argument is that, yes, he won the Epsom Derby, but of course you can recharge going down the hill. Ditto at Ascot with the King George, but Longchamp doesn't have that opportunity. So you have to be a proper 12 furlong horse. So maybe that's what lost him it in the first place, as well as the fact that, of course, no horse has ever won the St. Leger, followed immediately by the Arc, because it's really, really hard. Not many try it now anymore, of course.
No, that will come through later when we talk about another horse. But
yes,
our final near miss, although it wasn't, it was fairly near, wasn't it?
Nearish, yeah.
Yeah, you can't get much nearer than third, although he then lost third. There's the Japanese horse Deep Impact.
Exactly. I think I really can't stress enough just what a legend Deep Impact is in Japan. We know Japanese love their racing, and we know they're obsessed with the Arc, but Deep Impact took it genuinely to a whole new level. And he was the one that really sort of said, right, we are international players now. There's no denying it, because there'd been, billions put into the breeding program to get them there in the first place. couple of things you want to know about Deep Impact before we sort of talk about it. Again, he was incredibly fast and incredibly versatile. I don't think, we recognize that quite so much. He won the 10 furlong Satsuki Sho at Nakayama. He won that in 1 minute and 59.2 with an incredible burst. That's fast. You don't get races that fast in Europe over 10 furlongs. He then, later on, he ran over 2 miles. That was the spring edition of the Emperor's Prize, the Tenosho. And he beat the world record. He did it 3 minutes 13.4. I mean, he was properly good horse, and he was also tiny, not short. He was a sort of normal, I think, 16 hands, just around that. But he never weighed more than just over 450 kilos when he ran. And just to give you a measure of that, so 2 of the other horses I mentioned in the book, not ARC horses, but sort of big chunky mares, namely Black Caviar and Zenyatta, they both weighed over 100 kilos more than him. I mean, he was very slight, but obviously very, very strong. So when he arrived at the ARC, he'd only ever been beaten once before then. And the Japanese love affair with the ARC had been going on for so long, as we know. Still, who knows it? But it may all sort of come real this year. But they really felt that was their turn, and it was really interesting because there was 9,000 Japanese racing fans came that year. It was 2006, and I remember Paul Haig in the Racing Post called them the idolatrous thousands, because it wasn't just sort of older racing fans. There were loads of teenagers who'd saved up for the trip. Deep Impact got Japanese kids involved in racing, which was fantastic. There was over 21 million people watched in Japan, saw the race live in Japan. That's 16% of their population. That's how important it was to them. Think about that. They put in, I think it was €1.5 million was bet on the Paris Mutuel that day. So, and as a consequence, he was 10-1 on his official odds, based on the Paris Mutuel, even though the Japanese punters, most of them who were into it, said, no, even if he wins, I'm not cashing it in. I want it as a souvenir. That, he really transcended Japan in ways that I think we don't properly recognize. As it happened, as you say, he came a very close third within a length, and which I think was deflated the Japanese, but not half as much as what happened a fortnight later, because he had actually had a bit of an infection, which may have affected his performance. And they had, his trainer administered something called ipratropium, which was an inhaler to basically help with his respiratory illness that he'd had. And it's perfectly legal in Japan, but they hadn't understood that it contravened the French laws. So they had to disqualify him. He didn't actually finish third, he was disqualified as well, which I think was, crushing for all of them who, it wasn't just the Japanese who wanted him to win. I think, many of us here in Europe are dying for a Japanese winner. It would be fantastic. But sadly, it wasn't Deep Impact. But he more than made up for it, of course, afterwards as a fantastic stallion as well.
Yes, somebody sired an English Derby winner only quite recently as well.
That's right, yeah, and an Oaks winner and Guineas winner. No, he made and I think when he died as well, a few years ago, there was almost memorial days and sort of things set up for him that you again don't normally get for stallions. But he was truly something special.
When did making plans get this complicated? It's time to streamline with WhatsApp, the secure messaging app that brings the whole group together. Use polls to settle dinner plans. Send event invites and pin messages so no one forgets Mom's 60th. And never miss a meme or milestone. All protected with end-to-end encryption. It's time for WhatsApp. Message privately with everyone. Learn more at whatsapp.com.
This episode is brought to you by Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels and music are made for each other. They share a rhythm in the craft of making something timeless, while being a part of legendary nights. From backyard jams to sold-out arenas, there's a song in every toast. Please drink responsibly. Responsibility.org. Jack Daniels and Old No. 7 are registered trademarks. Tennessee whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume. Jack Daniel Distillery, Lynchburg, Tennessee.
At Sierra, discover top workout gear at incredible prices, which might lead to another discovery. Your headphones haven't been connected this whole time. Awkward. Discover top brands at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
Time to look at the Great British and Irish winners. I've got 5 of those. I'm going to start with a horse that was interesting to read more about. Vaguely Noble, who won in 1968, who moved about a lot and even had a connection with Sir Winston Churchill. I thought I'd throw his name in.
I'm now trying to remember what that connection is with Winston Churchill.
I've read your book very carefully.
I know. I'm trying to remember if I can remember every single fact from it. But go on, enlighten me. You share it.
It was.
The
breeding was connected to Winston Churchill's horse Vienna.
That's right. So yeah, that's right. That he was. It's always nice to go and have a nice little link with Churchill, isn't it? Yeah, Vaguely Noble, I think, is another one of those horses who's, he's often sort of forgotten, I think, when people sort of reflect on some of the true greats. But what's interesting about him, I think you mentioned it just now, when he won the Arc, yes, he was trained in France, but actually, more than most horses at the time, and sort of more as a reflection of what it is now, he sort of makes a mockery of saying, oh, this horse is an American horse or a British horse, whatever, because, horses don't understand the concept of passports, of course, but Vaguely Noble was bred in Ireland. He was trained in England. Then he was trained in France. He was owned by Americans. He was ridden by an Australian at the end. So, he belonged to all of us, really. He'd broken he'd been a very impressive 2-year-old and broken records in terms of when he was bought at auction. He cost so much that the owners sort of thought, well, the only races, in order to make back our money, the only races we could, he hadn't been put into any of the British classics or anything else. The only country which offered the purses that he could actually sort of make back some of that winnings, some of his spendings was France, and by extension the Arc, which is why he was then sent to, as a 3-year-old, to Etienne Paulet, who just had Seabird 3 years earlier. So he was thinking, fantastic, all this Christmas is coming at once. But when he's arrived at the Arc, he had, won several group races over the year quite easily, but his big rival at the time was going to be Saraiva, who had won an amazing derby where he just basically very late push from Piggott again. And Lester Piggott, I think, said at the time he was the best horse he'd ridden up until then. He was good. And it was a stellar lineup all the way through, in fact, because I think there were winners of 11 classics taking part in that race. There was a bit of soft ground, which I think helped him. But basically, when Bill Williamson, or Weary Willie Williamson, as he was called, gave him a push 2 furlongs out, there was him and Saraiva miles ahead of everybody else. 2 really good horses with 2 really good turns of foot. But Saraiva couldn't keep up with him. And just to prove that, he'd won lots of big races beforehand, Saraiva. He then went on to win the Champion Stakes and the Washington, D.C. International straight after. So he was good. He was very good. But Vaguely Noble was better. And I think it was Saraiva's owner, Raymond Guest, afterwards said Saraiva ran the best race of his life and was beaten by the best horse in the world. And there were few arguments. So he was a really impressive horse. And the father of Dahlia afterwards, who was another great sort of 1970s globe-trotting pioneer as well. So he did well at stud too.
And Vaguely Noble, the amazing thing about him, you said he didn't run in the classics, but as a 2-year-old, he won the Observer Gold Cup, which the race at Doncaster, which many different names since, but he won that race and then didn't run in any British classics.
That's right. He'd just because he hadn't sort of been entered in them, but I think he won it by, was it by 12? No, but won that one won the Observer Gold Cup by 7 lengths, and he'd won the Sandwich Stakes at Ascot by 12. He was not just precocious, but he followed it through. He liked cutting the ground, which of course for the Arc is usually quite. You look at the ground in the Arc; it's usually on the soft side, isn't it? Just because it's October, so that suited him well. But yeah, I'd have loved to have seen him run at 4 as well. But you could say that about many horses, couldn't you?
Next up is Mill Reef, who, correct me if I'm wrong, the first British trained winner of the Arc since 1948 when he won in 1971.
Yes, that's right. Mill Reef was, we're so focused on the Arc now as being such an important target for the great British horses that we forget that either for a long time, they either weren't winning it or they weren't even running in it. But he changed things. Obviously, I mean, your listeners, of course, will know an awful lot about Mill Reef. He was an excellent 2-year-old, winning several Group 1s at the time. He lost, of course, the 2000 to Brigadier Gerard, but of course Brigadier Gerard was more of a mile a 10 furlong horse, and Milreif was a lot more than that. He wasn't a miler. He was a real middle class hero. So there was no problem sort of losing to Milreif by 3 furlongs. He'd won the Derby when he just floated. He's got that wonderful floaty stride that he had. He then won the Eclipse. He beat Caro in the Eclipse, who himself had just won the Prix Gagné. He'd and his trainer Albert Klimcha said afterwards, "There's no disgrace to be beaten by a good horse, and Milreif is a great horse, better than Nijinsky." So he was certain about that too. Won the King George, and then when he comes to the Arc, what was interesting there was that when he'd gone to France the year before, I think it's for the Robert Papin, he'd had an appalling journey. Just everything had gone wrong. So this time, his trainer and Ian Balding basically took no risks, and he got permission from the US Embassy to fly from a nearby airbase called Greenham Air Base right by his stables, like 10 minutes away. So between leaving his stables and pretty much arriving at Le Bourget Airport just outside Paris, took 2 hours rather than sort of a day as it sort of used to take in those times. So he was much more relaxed and happy when he arrived. And it sort of showed in the race where he scooted clear, I think, of 3 lengths. There was the excellent French filly Pistol Packer, 3 lengths behind. And the French loved him too, because they were comparing him to Seabird the next day. He was just this horse everybody fell in love with, wasn't he? There was just something he was sort of small but perfectly formed. And I think that, Claire Balding, of course, we all know now, is a very respected racing expert and presenter. She said later, "My father does not remember the fact that his first child was born in 1971 because all that year means to him is Milreif, because he had that sort of effect, not just on the public, but on his trainer as well." So yeah, he sort of reset it for, like you said, for British horses who had had a long period of not being part of the Arc scene for a long time, but that things began to change from then. And I think he was the first American bred and American owned, as in the two of them together, horse to win the Arc as well. Because until then, of course, it was much more of a European thing, but there's sort of, again, an extra element of internationalism about it.
Yeah, he was owned by Paul Mellon.
Paul Mellon, yeah, and named after a club, I think, that Paul Mellon was a member of in one of the islands where he had where he's a member of a club, which was called the Milreif Club, and that's who he named it after.
Going back to your flight, that permission must have gone to the highest levels, I would imagine.
Yes, it went to the American ambassador, but apparently he was, he flew him over with. It was the U.S. Air Force who actually sort of flew him over. It wasn't a sort of private flight, but she was treated impeccably, and if you're going to do it, they did it properly. So I'm surprised more people don't try that these days. But of course, I think the options have changed a little since then, haven't they?
Our next horse, alleged winner in 1977, 1978, Piggott, Sangster and O'Brien.
Yeah, they were a trio in the 70s, weren't they? So we're going to talk about another Arc jockey later on called Jacques de Jasper and Tantième. The reason I mention him now is because it's all about jockey confidence in the Arc and dual winners. And Lester Piggott displayed during alleged career, and specifically in the Arc, I think, that all the behaviours that made him both utterly infuriating but also an out-and-out genius. So when Alleged arrived at the Arc, his first Arc in 77, he'd never won a Group 1 before. He had won Group 2s. He was never meant to actually run in Europe. He was scheduled to run in Europe, in America, where he was bred, but he had sort of slightly dodgy knees, and they thought, no, the California dirt's going to be a bit too hard for him. So which is why he came over to be trained by Vincent O'Brien at Ballydoyle. And he was sort of a bit backward. Everybody ignored him. Throughout the summer, everybody was talking about the minstrel winning lots of big races. So he sort of quietly won races really quite impressively. And then they thought, oh, hang on, he could, including the Great Voltager Stakes, but they thought, oh, he could win the Leger. Piggott messed up in the Leger. There's really no way around it. He basically acted accidentally as a pacemaker to Dunfermline, the Queen's horse. And it's safe to say that Robert Sangster was livid. He said afterwards, Leicester was told to hold Alleged up, but he kicked on early in the home straight and acted like a pacemaker for Dunfermline. Vincent was so devastated he dropped his binoculars before the finish. And I think what's funny about that is that Piggott should have felt a bit contrite, but instead he said not that long afterwards, well, a good jockey doesn't need orders, and a bad jockey couldn't carry them out anyway. So it's best not to give them any. So, that was the backdrop behind the Arc when he sort of arrived. And he said, and Piggott had actually said, I don't know if he'll win the Leger, but he will win the Arc. And everyone's going, really? He's never won a Grade 1 before. There's 26 horses that year, which is huge. O'Brien and Sangster sort of told him really clearly, you must hold up alleged to play to his strengths. So what did Piggott do? When the horses sort of, there's the Petit Bois just on the back of the back straight there of Longchamp. They were sort of watching again through the binoculars. And of course, rather than holding the back of the 26 horses, they see Piggott's, very idiosyncratic bottom sticking in the air right at the front of the 26 horses, thinking he's doing the exact opposite of what we told him to do. But he sort of knew what he was doing because he kept out of trouble over the 26 horses. He slowed things down. He dictated the pace. And then he had a good kick at the end of it, and nobody could come near him. He allowed himself a little smile on the way back. And so it was a sort of, Piggott sort of annoying people, but then doing what he needed to do very, very well. So that was his first victory. The following year, he stayed in training and actually had a very difficult year where he was sort of injured and jarred legs. Then he had an infection. He finally managed to get a quick warm-up in the Prix du Prince d'Orange, where he accidentally got a course record just a couple of weeks before the Arc. But then they finally sort of managed to get him ready. And then they thought, okay, do we even bother giving Lester Piggott instructions again? They thought, no, let's not bother. And sure enough, Piggott, rather than going from the front again, just went right to the back like he was being told to do the year before. But guess what? He got it right, and this time he stormed through with a good turn of foot, and he was 2 lengths victory over Trillion, and I think he was syndicated for $13 million at the time, which was huge to go and stand in stud, and got very high ratings based on just those 2 performances more than anything else, really. But yeah, quite an idiosyncratic horse as well. But it took the likes of Piggott to sort of took it to a whole new level with him.
The next winner we're going to discuss is the winner in 1986, who's probably remembered for 2 things. This is Dancing Brave, coming second in the Derby, and then and I watched it again before I spoke to you, his electrifying burst to win the 1986 Arc.
Yeah, Dancing Brave was, when I first got into racing in my youthful days, back in the 80s when I was a kid. He was the first great horse that I remember watching firsthand, thinking there's something extraordinary about him. Not pretty, mind you. He was an ordinary sided, that famously parrot-mouthed head of his, and rather imperfect forelegs. But yeah, he'd won the 2,000 guineas impressively, And Greville Starkey, his jockey, said afterwards, "Oh, he's bomb-proof. Of course, he'll win the Derby." And of course, you can't talk about him and not talk about the Derby. He played the waiting game. The question is, did he play the waiting game too long, or was it something else? The bottom line is, he was in an impossible position with 2 furlongs left to run when Greville Starkey pressed go. Like I said, that the penultimate furlong when he let him go was 10.3 seconds, and that's up the slightly uphill, Epsom finish. And and it's on a camber. Next time you're watching the racing on TV and you look at those splits, just think about how quick that is. The point is, unfortunately, it wasn't quick enough that day. And the question still remains, was it was the ultimate jockey's nightmare? Did he make a fatal misjudgment, or was he just really unbalanced going down the hill and he couldn't control him? All that everybody can agree on is that it was screamingly clear that the best horse didn't win that day. But of course, he then did win, the Eclipse, the King George afterwards. So when it came to October, he was favourite again. And the lineup for the Arc most years is very impressive, but 86 I would put in the top 3 as one of the, in terms of just the sheer depth of quality. And it's worth, again, just looking, you just watched it again, Stephen, but there's, Baring, who came second. He was a grandson of Seabird, actually. He'd won the Prix du Jockey Club in record time. You had Triptyque, who was a hero for many. Derara, you had a Catanango, the German champion. You had Sharastani himself, who'd won the Derby. Lots of others. It was properly good lineup. And when the sort of analogy I made when you saw Baring sort of look as if he'd got the race, is that Pat Edgery then took Dancing Brave around the outside, and it was like a peregrine falcon sort of swooping down. It felt like he was just literally swooping to take his prey, and then he was a sort of length and a half, 2 lengths clear at the end of it against really good horses running up to form. And it was a real champion's display by a champion racehorse. That day, in I think the official ratings, the European classification ratings, I think was the highest rating that was given to a horse up until then. I think beaten since by, again, you by Frankel, but you have to take those with a pinch of salt, of course, because there's still an element of, well, what it's like. But of course, we know afterwards he had that pretty miserable experience in the Breeders' Cup where everything went wrong. But until then, he was that performance was one of the greats. Yeah.
Our final British and Irish winner stormed through the 3-year-old racing scene in 2009 in See the Stars.
Still one of the most impressive 3-year-old seasons, isn't it? Not just unbeaten, but the combination of races and the length of those, from April to October, really impressive. But it was, even after his second race that year, the Derby, Mick Kinnan sort of jumped off in that strange little intense winners' enclosure at Epsom, and he went to John Ox, the trainer's ear, and he just whispered, "This is one of the greats. He's the best I've ever ridden." And Kinnan didn't go around saying that often. And he actually said, there was a statement he said afterwards, he said, "I was going so easily that it felt as though the other horse had been running in slow motion." He was, Ballydoyle threw everything at him that year, and he just swatted it all back. And I think, what was interesting also, he'd won the first 2 legs of the Triple Crown, but nobody even considered that he would run in the St. Leger because, which I think was a sign in itself as to why we may never have another Triple Crown winner. But that was, that's for another issue. But ultimately, though, it was all going to be about the Arc, and he'd been on the go, winning all those big races, all year. He'd had no mid-season break, big field, really good field of 19 that year. And then, sure enough, he didn't look great because he was a beautiful horse, but that day he just looked at, some people say, oh, he's gone over the top. And then he starts pulling his head, and everything looked wrong, frankly. And then he's sort of at the back, sort of a bit boxed in. And it was only when he just found a gap in the home stage and Kinnan said, "Right, let's go for this." And he just absolutely bolts clear. And he still had it. And he was 3 lengths clear before being eased. And I think he's still the only horse to have ever won the Guineas, the Derby, and the Arc. Dancing Brave, of course, came near, but not near enough. So he was, he was certainly the best Irish horse since Nijinsky, and arguably, depending how you measure these things, he was absolutely one of the best. And he had a beautiful pedigree, and that was a sort of sad thing because he was only ever going to go after age 3. After that, he was only ever going to go to stud afterwards, rather than sort of let us enjoy him on the course for another year. But yeah, wonderful horse, and I think actually worth quoting John Ox as well. Towards the end of his career, towards the end of the horse's career, John Ox said, "He's perfect, the perfect racing machine. He is the point to which thoroughbred breeding after 300 years has arrived." And when you saw his performances and you saw just the perfect confirmation of that horse, it didn't feel misplaced.
Well, thanks for discussing the British and Irish winners and the near misses. We're now going to discuss the one Italian winner, Rebo, in 1955 and 56.
He was, it's the only one we're going to discuss today. He was not the only Italian winner, but he was certainly the best. And he was not just the best Italian, he could have been one of the best of all. And I think what's interesting, just a couple of things about Rebo, because I know a lot of people know about Rebo, but here's a few little factoids I wanted to mention about him.
I hope you're going to mention the sheep, are you? Or...
no, the sheep comes with Ali France. We're coming to that later.
Oh, right. Yeah. My research was wrong there. Yeah.
No, exactly. But there are a couple of... But he had something similar, which I'll come to in a minute. So firstly, Rebo wasn't... A bit like we were talking about Vaguely Noble beforehand. Rebo wasn't entered into any of the Italian or French or English classics because he was tiny yearling. And they just thought, he's a bit runty. So his nickname was Il Piccolo, the little one. So it was only when he sort of fleshed himself out, age 2 and 3, that, okay, he's very nice and big now, but it was too late. But he won everything else in frightening ease. And he never even looked like he was going to get beaten. But he was also a very fractious horse and got very, very coltish easily. And it was his groom that noticed that he was always being difficult until he was quite near a stablemate in the same vicinity as a stablemate called Magistris, and who was very chilled. And each time Magistris was there, Ribot would suddenly get calm and think, oh, okay. So then every time Ribot went to the races, whether it was in Ireland or France or England, they would just take Magistris with him, even though he wasn't running himself, because it would just calm him down. So he'd won all the big races around Italy up until his first arc, always by like 10 lengths, 15 lengths, just very impressive. And then when he arrived at his first arc, he started at 9-1, which I think sort of sounds almost farcical now when you're thinking it's Ribot starting a race at 9-1. But there you go. But because they thought, how good is he? And the answer was very, very good. So he beats a very international field by 3 lengths. And then straight, a couple of weeks afterwards, he goes back to Milan for what they call the Italian arc at the time, the Gran Premio del Jockey Club, in which he wins by 15 lengths from the previous winner. So he won as a 3-year-old in 55, really impressively. Then he's one of those horses, like so many, who goes from 3 to 4 and becomes even better, as many horses do, and they should. So he'd won lots over that 4-year-old season, including the King George, where he ran in mud and just still trounced everybody. Then he comes to his second arc, where that seals immortality for many, and it was an even higher caliber than the year before. So Irish Derby winner, top French horse 3-year-olds, the 2 top US middle distance horses, Career Boy and Mr. Boying, and which I wish they would come over more often, to be honest. And he, despite all this, he absolutely poured it on it was quite muddy, but he poured it on in the straight. The official winning distance was 6 lengths, but you just watch that race, look at the photos, it isn't 6, it's easily 9. They sort of round it, just embarrassing to be something else, which, even though it's unofficial, that would have been the longest winning distance. It's clear it's the longest winning distance of any arc. And got himself a huge rating in the process, one of the highest ever. And then, but what's important here is that just a bit of context to that 56 race. So yes, he started odds on, but then you had Talgo, who was an Irish Derby winner, a classic winner. He's available at 100-1. Then you had the American horse Career Boy. So he's ridden by Eddie Arcaro, that legendary US jockey, old Banana Nose. And he was saying, I was going along there pretty good, fast enough to win it, I thought, when all of a sudden, whoosh, a horse takes off from me so fast I couldn't recognize him. So that sort of has the echoes of that Faris race I was describing earlier. And important fact, just again to talk about the strength and depth, is that half the horses that Ribot trounced that day went on to win a Group 1 in the next 18 months, and yet he had absolutely annihilated them. He was truly, truly brilliant.
2 interesting facts I found out from your book about Ribot is he was bred at the National Stud. That's one of them.
Yes, which I think was based in Sussex at the time. He was bred in that, and it was all part of the sort of master plan of the Wizard of Dormello, as he was called, which was his breeder Federico Tesio, who also bred Niarco, the other great unbeaten Italian champion of the 20th century. But yeah, that's where he had breeding from, and then he had a difficult time afterwards. Actually, I'm going to give one little extra factoid, so that those people who know their Italian sport or Italian football, there's the
he was very popular, wasn't he? Very
hugely popular. Yeah. And again, this is the important thing about some of these greats that transcend the sport in a way, like I was talking about Deep Impact earlier on. So in the Gazzetta dello Sport, which is normally sort of talks about football most of the time, to be honest, they held a poll at the end of the 20th century for the greatest Italian athletes, which of course can mean any sport. And Ribot was voted in as the 4th greatest Italian athlete by the Italians themselves. Not horse, best athlete. That they were comparing. That's how they were sort of viewing him, as this, alongside actual athletes and sports people. Something very sort of poignant about that. But again, you had to be amazing in order to get that sort of level of coverage outside of the normal channels.
That's it for part 1 of Longchamp Legends. We'll be back very soon with part 2, where Oli joins me to look at the greatest arc champions from France, the home of the famous race. And you won't want to miss when Oli reveals who he thinks is the best of them all. You can catch the show on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, or listen on our YouTube channel. Thanks for tuning in.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.